I just think this regime is quite unpredictable. And that's a shame, Mary. That is such a shame, because there's nothing more powerful than people-to-people engagement.
Right.
And so, again, that's why I spent 3 years writing this book. And I will say that I got so much pushback from editors and publishers, because they wanted me to write the story of, oh, if I escaped Iran, or, you know, woman behind the veil. And I said, I don't want, that's not my story. That story has been told. In fact, if we go to the library, we are in the library, or any bookstore, those are the stories on Iran. But very rarely we have stories and narratives and films about the people and real life. And I sure hope we continue telling these stories rather than victimization of these people or the negative behavior of their government. I think we already know that.
So we're now at about the 1-year mark of the protests. The US and Iran just agreed to a prisoner swap and unfreezing of $6 billion in Iranian assets. So does this step signal real change in the US-Iran relationship? And do steps combined like this with sustained unrest mean that Iran is in fact at a crossroads, to quote the title of tonight's program? So we're fortunate to be joined tonight by Tara Kangarlou to help us think this through. So good evening, everyone. I'm Mary Eintema, president of WorldBoston, and we're delighted that you're here with us tonight for Great Decisions. Right away, some thank yous. We thank the Lowell Institute, which generously supports the Great Decisions series. And you might also know that the Lowell Institute recently provided additional funding, allowing us to make our Chat and Chowder monthly series also free. For the sake of time, I'm abbreviating Tara's impressive biography, but please do read it in full online. Tara Kangarlou is an award-winning American journalist, television host, and author who has reported, written, and produced for NBC LA, CNN, CNN International, and Al Jazeera America, covering some of the most pressing issues in the United States and around the world. Her writing and reporting have also appeared in news outlets such as Time, Vanity Fair, The Huffington Post, and AI Monitor. Tara has served as a fellow at the East-West Institute and the McCain Institute, and is a frequent contributor to international news outlets on the MENA region, foreign affairs, and humanitarian issues. Her expertise ranges from global conflicts in the Middle East to international and cultural affairs. In 2016, as a result of her work, Tara founded The Art of Hope, the first American nonprofit strictly focused on supporting the mental health and psychosocial needs of war-torn refugees in Lebanon. Further, her award-winning book, which we have upstairs, The Heartbeat of Iran, was released in 2021. This book invites readers into the heart and soul of a country that's often seen through a political fog that blurs the features of real life. Tara was born and raised in Tehran and moved to the US in her late teens. She's bilingual in English and Farsi and currently splits her time between London and Washington, DC, where she is teaching at Georgetown University School of Foreign Service. She has a bachelor's from UCLA in English literature and a master's in journalism from USC. Okay, Tara, thank you very much for joining us tonight. I'm going to kick things off with a big question. So let's look back a year and reflect, if you would, about what progress, if any, has been made on the protesters' demands, where we're at in US-Iran relations as a result of the prisoner swap. What's been the state of play over this past year in your interpretation?
Thank you, Mary. Before I answer those two questions, I'm going to thank the audience and, of course, you and your colleagues, Natalie, for having me, and WorldBoston. And if I may, because I'm so proud of the work that we do with Art of Hope, we started in Lebanon, but now we have operations in southern Turkey and northern Syria and eastern Ukraine. So I just wanted to share that because it's a project that's near and dear to my heart. But coming back to your questions, I want to answer the first part, which is about the protests that started last year and where we are with that, and then the second pertaining to the prison swap. The protests, as we saw, were brutally cracked down. They were brutally stifled by the Iranian regime. As you mentioned, more than 500 people were killed. Again, these numbers are not accurate. Oftentimes, they are much more than what organizations from the outside can count. But the fact that the government itself acknowledges that they have essentially released thousands of detainees, that says that the numbers were so high and this crackdown was just enormous. But if you go to Iran right now, if you go on the streets of big cities, you actually would be surprised. Women and girls are continuing to defy the regime's mandatory call for this wearing of the headscarves. I have family and friends in Iran right now that send photos and say, you know what, we take off our hijab, we take off our scarf, and we're not afraid, even though that the government has put in place further measures to either detain people or fine people. And I also want to open a parenthesis here because like so many other things with the Iranian government, it's not really about the values that they want to promote. It's a money-making machine. They make so much money by arresting people, fining them, getting bails, and charging so much fine and then releasing them. So now they have all these tactics, these Chinese-made surveillance that can send you an SMS. Oh, we saw you not wearing your hijab on such and such street, and it's cost you $50 or $20 or whatever. And so it has become an industry, Mary. Okay, and women and girls in Iran are trying to defy it as much as they can. Again, a year on. Of course, the protests in the one-year anniversary were not as large as what we saw last year. Parents are afraid to let their kids out. I mean, we saw last year these were children, teenagers on the street, and that also is quite telling. My generation. In some ways, when I speak with friends who stayed in Iran, they're so tired, they're so fatigued, they're so disillusioned. That level of apathy is so much. And then, the parents' generation too as well. But the young generation, the Gen Z as we call it, they know better. They're enlightened, they're educated, they're connected with the rest of the world, and they know what they want. And they absolutely cannot tolerate an archaic medieval system that shoves their version of reality up their throat and tells them to live this way. They have no tolerance toward that. But of course, because of the brutality of the crackdowns, the protests didn't really sustain. And also, I mean, we can talk about this further, but also this lack of leadership. The opposition leadership in Iran really doesn't exist in a systematic way to bring a revolution home, if you so will. And of course, from abroad, it has its own challenges. And I'm not trying to rush through answering the question, but I'm cognizant of time, and I want to get to your the second part of your question, which was about the prisoner swap. These 5 prisoners, if you listen to the administration and, the line that the Biden administration has is that this was an isolated exchange. This was an isolated deal with Iran, and it really has nothing to do with the administration's policy toward the country right now. I just listened to Admiral Kirby, who's at NSC right now, I think, he was saying that, again, the nuclear talks are not a priority. This was something that came out last year immediately after the protests, because the administration heard from Iranians all over the world, really, in Iran, in the United States, elsewhere, that we don't want anyone to deal with the regime. So since then, it has continued to not be a priority, the JCPOA and the revival of the nuclear deal. But of course, again, according to the administration, the United States is keen on preventing Iran, to reach a nuclear weapon and so on. So that's the line. With regards to the prison swap, as folks know and heard, the American citizens left Iran on the basis that Iran would have access to $6 billion of their own money that was blocked in South Korea. And this was a money from the purchase of gas, oil and gas, and essentially South Korea was afraid to give the money to Iran because they thought they will be sanctioned by the United States, right? And again, according to the administration, Iran's use of this money that's being coordinated by Qatar will be monitored by the Treasury. Mm-hmm. So it's supposedly only going to be used for humanitarian purposes. But then again, the critics and opponents always ask the question, why deal with a regime that is so vile and ignorant to some of the basic fundamental human rights? And the counter argument to that is because this was our only leverage to get our American citizens back. So,
mm-hmm. So let's say a year later, have we gone back to status quo, or do you think that any lasting change has? I mean, we can talk about outside of Iran and within Iran. Do you think that any lasting change has occurred or is occurring within Iran?
That is such an important question, and I'm not sure if I have the right answer for it, or if there's one answer to that question. Mm-hmm. But what I can say is that Iran and Iranians will never go back to September 15, the day before Mahsa Amini's killing. What happened in Iran, in many ways, categorically unmasked the Iranian regime and their perpetual disregard for the livelihood and rights of its citizens. Iran is a country of 83 million people, some of the most vibrant, educated, sophisticated people in that entire region. Women make up the largest number of university graduates. They're part of the workforce. They're part of the society. So this is not an isolated country where women are just, sitting at home and not part of the daily discourse. Mm-hmm. So what happened is that I think the world got to see that. I think for the first time, Mary, the world got to the world got the opportunity to distinguish between the Iranian people and the Islamic regime. And that's something that has been my thesis for the longest time as a journalist. I've always focused on the people and their stories and what's at stake for them. Even with the heartbeat of Iran, it's about the people. Because so long as countries and its people, in this case the United States and Americans, don't understand the hopes and desires and aspirations of their counterparts in Iran, I believe that change cannot come, because it's that empathy and that connection that can develop in long-term sustainable progress. And so what happened since last year, again, has anything really changed in Iran? Not really. Mm-hmm. The government is as vile and as adamant to stifle any dissent, any opposition. I mean, more than any other time, we are seeing academics, students, folks in the arts and culture, movie industry, anyone who has anything to say against the regime's line is being detained. Mm-hmm. I mean, 2 weeks ago, there was this massive sort of poaching of brilliant professors in some of the country's best universities that were detained and essentially kicked out. And so that shows us that the regime is afraid. They know that they are not wanted. They know that they're resented. And I think that is one of the biggest changes that we've seen, that everybody is united in their resentment toward this regime, and they're just hanging by a thread.
Well, so let's take this opportunity, since we're with you, as opposed to somebody who just has an academic or policy perspective. Let's really look at the people side of this question. One of the things I hope that we can do is start to understand kind of some of the elements of the society that we hear about, but I'm going to come back to that. Tell me about, from a more heartfelt perspective, tell me about your book, how you came to write it, and what you're hoping to achieve with the book, because it really is about people.
Absolutely. Thank you for that question. As you mentioned, I'm an American journalist. I was born and raised in Iran. I lived there until I was 17. And until I was 24, I was always back and forth. My father was a physician in Tehran, even though my parents were both US educated in the 60s. And so for me, Iran was my mother and the United States was my father, but they were divorced. And so, I loved both countries, and I always found myself wanting to explain my Iranian heritage and identity to my American friends and counterparts. And so fast forward, when I started professionally entering the journalism world as an American reporter, as an American journalist, I continued to see that. I continued to see that the Iran story was only told through news headlines and this very isolated and monolithic narrative that was focused on the regime's rogue behavior, the hostage crisis, people that we can't even pronounce their names, and so on.
But you're mocking me.
No, I'm not
asking.
No.
With some names.
No. I'm talking about Ahmadinejad, and Khamenei and Khomeini and all of that, all the khiz. And so, for me, there was a problem there, right? And again, putting my American journalist hat on, I thought, if the Iranian people can't tell their own story, someone else will tell that story for them. And that story will be one that either they don't like or one that's not accurate. So then that's really what led me to wanting to write The Heartbeat of Iran. And Mary, it was a passion project. It took me 3 years. I stationed myself in Istanbul because that was the closest I could get to Iran, because I imagine I'll be arrested the minute I step foot, former CNN, former Al Jazeera, what are you doing here? And so in 2017, I started lining up the interviews, trying to find the characters and the people that I wanted to feature in the book. And I tell my students, you need to live and breathe the society if you want to be a strong reporter of that culture and country and environment. I can't do the same book on, let's say, a country in Latin America because I haven't spent time there. I haven't lived the society and I haven't lived the culture. You need to understand the nuances and complexities because Iran, again, like I said, is a country of 83 million human beings, but unfortunately the world looks at the country as 83 million nuclear heads. And there's a huge distinction there. And for many of our American friends and audiences, again, speaking as a journalist, Iran's history starts, on a cold winter day in 1979. Iran's history exceeds beyond the last 42 years. And that is important. So I thought I want to introduce that alternative narrative to this very monolithic view on Iran, and that is to introduce the people of this country to their counterparts that are you guys and us in the United States and around the world.
So how even specifically did you manage that back in 2017? Things have become even tighter since then. And we were just talking about that. You're a specialist on Iran. How do you get in and out? Can you get in and out? How do you stay up to date with the heartbeat of Iran?
That's a great question. So again, like I said, I didn't go to Iran because I just didn't want to put myself at risk, anyone else at risk. And as any good producer and journalist would do remotely, you line up interviews, and I'm grateful for all the contacts and resources that I have in the country. I mean, I grew up there. I knew how to find people. I knew where to go, and thank God for Twitter at some point. I mean, now it's X. I don't know how reliable that is, but you find people. That's what journalists do. And again, this is not a political book, but of course you mentioned the word Iran, and it's political. My focus was to tell the stories of these individuals, but add context and nuance, and allow my American and sort of non-Iranian readers to understand the isms. And so each story that you read is not just about that one person, but it's layers and layers of history, religious context, and sort of political nuance that would allow you to understand what on earth is going on in Iran today. What are the complexities that exist in that society? And again, this goes back to the first question that you asked. Iranian people, and especially Iranian women and girls, and I wrote this in my piece in Time magazine last year. It was the first piece that covered the Mahsa Amini's killing. Was that Iranian people are on the street willing to get killed, not because they're longing to wear mini skirts or go bare. No, because they're longing for their freedom of choice, to be able to be decision makers in their own lives, to not be victims of extremely poor policies of a regime that is only concerned with its own vitality and its own survival, really.
Well, so let's drill into that. This one more question that I'm going to turn to our colleagues here, but to try and help us understand how the pieces of society in Iran fit together. I mean, I think many of us would be surprised to know that there's a large Jewish population. The LGBTQ people exist there, as they do everywhere. But I think in your timepiece, the morality police, that part of the Revolutionary Guards, people in the morality police or affiliated with them account for something like 10% of the population. That's a massive chunk of society. But then you have, lots of educated women, the urban-rural divide. Can we talk about Iran as an entity?
Again, great point that you mentioned. I want to share a quick anecdote. I don't know how many people saw the Time image last year with the 3 women without the hijab from the back. How many people saw that cover? Yes. I was talking to some friends in Iran, and you know what they said? They said, how cool would it have been if they actually would have someone who's wearing a hijab? Because that would show the tolerance that we want in this country. We want to live together, we want to coexist together despite our differences. And that's the spirit of Iranian people in Iran. They want to live together despite their religious and political views, and be able to freely express those views. But coming to your question, it's fascinating. If you look at a country of 83, 84 million people, 10%, I'm not really good at math, but is not that many in reality, and those are the people that really feed from the regime. Okay, and in that piece, I explored who these people are. These are people who attack mothers, daughters, sons. Who are these people? So many of these folks, Mary, are of course ideologically brainwashed. They are true revolutionary-minded individuals that fascinate me to these days. I mean, I remember growing up in Iran, you would avoid walking by people who you would tell they're part of that clout. out. You know, we would dodge morality police. I was arrested by the morality police. My sister was arrested by the morality police. I mean, it was part of our lives, but there were ways that we could dodge them. And then part of that sort of 10% or, you know, whatever that number is, they're vulnerable people who are so desperate. They are so financially desperate that would do anything. And so that's another part of it. But again, that doesn't discount the fact that there are people who are truly brainwashed by the ideology of the Islamic regime. But I want to emphasize that the majority of the country is not like that, and in fact is quite the contrary. And so I think the more we focus on the other side of Iran, which is this vibrant, potent society, young people, just like, you know, the folks who are sitting here on the front row, students who want to belong to the world, who have the same hopes and dreams as you. There's absolutely no difference between a 20-year-old person in Iran than a 20-year-old person in the United States. They have the same vision for life. And I always try to bring forth ideas that they can connect. And I want to say, as sort of isolated and censored as Iran is, people are connected. I mean, the power of social media is so profound. And I think we saw examples of that last year. But Mary, if I may, I also want to add this. I just remembered that since last year, the exodus of young minds out of Iran has also been profound. Young people have no hope and they want to leave. For example, Turkey, neighboring country to Iran, is home to some of the largest numbers of Iranian migrants who just want to leave. And right now, someone was telling me, I'm actually quoting, says, you know, we're not looking for, you know, to migrate. We're looking to escape. And there's a difference. And that's dangerous.
So in one of your pieces, you quoted a gentleman from a very interesting family, kind of, you know, that has ended up on two different sides of pro-regime, anti-regime. And he gave the opinion that for substantive change to happen in Iran, it's ultimately going to be a question of the opposition unifying across the country and sustaining an effort. Do you see that as possible?
Part of me wish you didn't answer that question, because my immediate answer is, how can that be possible when the regime is so steadfast in choking any movement? Any movement is being choked, right? So I don't have an answer to that. But what I can say is that there are brilliant minds inside Iran, so many of them in prison, women and men together, who, if given the opportunity or if allowed, can bring that change. And the people of Iran deserve that. Then, if I may add, you have sort of the opposition figures and voices abroad in the diaspora. And unfortunately, one of my wishes was that they too would unite. I think one of the things that we saw last year is that there were so many attacks on individuals, and, you know, instead of uniting, people started focusing on differences. And so in lieu of a forceful opposition in Iran, I so wish that there was a united opposition from abroad to at least give some hope, maybe.
Okay, last question, because I'm sure there's many questions out there. Is anything that we, which doesn't even really exist, but we in the West do, going to have much influence on the direction of Iran's development?
Another great question, and actually one that
kind of
might
a big
take
question.
time. No, exactly. It's a big question, and it would take. So Mary, very big question. So again, we saw, we can talk about sanctions, we can talk about, for example, last year, the UN, they put Iran, they essentially kicked Iran from this, women's rights committee. Excuse me for not saying the name correctly right now. But then a few months later, Iran was put back on this sort of human rights body, and it's very contradictory. And then, you have the officials remaining, in European countries, the offsprings and children of so many of these government officials are here in the United States, even in the city. So there's a lot of contradictions, right? There are still, Western countries are still legitimizing, the Islamic regime. There are talks of European countries putting IRGC on the terrorist list. They're not. So all these things exist, right? And I don't have the answer to say, oh, they should do this and that and not do that. That's a long discussion for experts. But what I would say, to answer your question, what we can do, and what I hope we do, is that for 40 years, we focused on the violent behavior of the Islamic regime and the rogue entity that they are. What I hope we do is, moving forward, we focus on the people of Iran, develop our understanding of its youth, develop our understanding of the impact that engagement would have in our society here in the United States, on the global stage, and also Iran itself. I sure know that if we build bridges and engagement with the people of Iran, however that is, not tomorrow or next year, but in long term, we are going to see change. And that is really, really my hope, because the values that we share with the Iranian people are so much than what we were told and what we imagine.
Okay, a call for sustained engagement. Thank you very much. Okay, so I imagine that we've got questions, and I'm looking right into the lights, but we're going to sort it out. So, sir, right in the middle there, we'll start with you. Can you raise your hand again? Yeah. Yep. I really can't see, but and a mic is coming to you, and then we'll go back up a few rows, and I think Mary is going to help you, right? So, go right ahead.
In view of of your pessimistic outlook about all of this, and just to,
Can we hear?
In view of your somewhat pessimistic outlook, I would think it would seem that the evidence that that popular uprising is not going to do anything based on the current suppression and the suppression of the previous one near the time of the Arab Spring, when there was a huge uprising among young people, particularly in Iran, that was crushed very badly. So I would ask you, the other alternative is to have a change from power blocks that already exist in Iran. For example, the Revolutionary Guard may not be monolithic in nature, could be a group that could foment a revolution in a good direction. There is also a guerrilla movement that exists on the boundaries of Iran. And there's potentially, in some of the political parties that have been suppressed and had some of their leaders jailed, there can be alternative power groups. Do any of those groups have a chance of possibly causing political change by more traditional power politics?
Thank you.
Thank you. I think we touched on this a bit. I sure have no hope in IRGC, because they are.
The IRGC is the Revolutionary Guard.
Yes,
right.
Yeah. And they're really what's keeping this regime alive. But again, like I said, there are brilliant minds inside Iran, so many of them in prison. How they can gain momentum to bring that change, I think is the million-dollar question. And I don't have an answer for that, because we've seen over and over and over that it hasn't bear fruit. But a sort of internal coup d'etat, if that's what you're asking, it's certainly, I don't think, in my opinion, it's going to come from the military or the IRGC and so on. And quite frankly, it's funny, because last year, people in Iran were saying, join, not to the IRGC. Again, there's a distinction between the military and the IRGC. They wanted the military to intervene. It's just they can't.
What is that distinction? Can you play that out for
Yes,
us?
yes. So the IRGC is the Sepah Pastara is a paramilitary that was started that was created after the Islamic Revolution, and their sole mission is preserving Velayat Faqih and the Islamic regime. And within the IRGC, you have different prongs, and the morality police is one of the little sort of offsprings and offshoots of it. So they're incredibly powerful.
There's regular military.
Yes, and then there's yes. But IRGC has its own aerospace, grounds, Quds Force. It's part of the IRGC. Their influence has been seen across the region in Iraq and Syria and Lebanon. So they are the most powerful entity in this country, and also financially, they own some of the biggest conglomerates in Iran. Oil and gas, car, automotive industry, and a lot of commercial entities are in the hands of IRGC. So for their own longevity, they love what's going on. They're not going to give up.
Okay. So Mary, you had somebody right there, I think. Yep.
Thank you. It was very interesting. I was kind of surprised when you said that women constituted the largest number of university graduates. And I think you said they also were participating in professional activity, because we hear so much about Afghanistan, where girls aren't allowed to go to school, and obviously in Iran, women are being killed. So I was wondering if you could elaborate a bit on exactly, for example, I think you said your dad was a physician. Could your mother practice medicine? Are there women attorneys and other, what exactly is the status of women on a professional and day-to-day basis?
Thank you for that question, and I sure hope you would read The Heartbeat of Iran, because I think you would find it fascinating. My mom wasn't a physician. She was a nutritionist by craft. And I will say that my mom was hospitalized in Iran recently, and two of her specialists were physicians, so I would say that she was really saved by two female physicians, who, by the way, would not wear the hijab in the hospital, and so on. I appreciate that question, because that goes back to my point about understanding Iranian people and Iranian youth and how much we share in common with them. Certainly, we can't compare Iranian society and where women are today with Afghanistan. Because it's very different. It's quite different. Women and girls go to school. They're educated. They're part of the society. There's all the professions that you can imagine. But what's lacking in Iran right now, that's truly frustrating men and women equally, is a dismal financial crisis that exists, lack of job opportunity, but also a little bit more for women is women's rights, sort of in the domestic space, in workforce. There are a lot of challenges for women, but certainly, the vision that perhaps folks have of Afghanistan does not apply to Iran at all.
I was just reading that 87% literacy in Iran. I think that the U.S. is probably not much higher, or maybe lower. Okay, anybody else? Do we have any of the young people who've joined us tonight who'd like, how about you right here? Yeah.
You mentioned that the government and the people have sort of this separate thought process, and that there's only a certain amount of individuals who have this brainwashing. But I was curious what the general population's perspective is on the United States and on Israel, because I know in the airport it says like Israel's the small evil and then the United States is the larger evil. Correct me if it's like not exactly correct, but I just wanted to know sort of the perception of these two countries within Iran?
Absolutely. And again, I hope you read my book because we talk about that in the stories. I will share with you actually a personal story. In Iran growing up, when you're in the assembly line, every morning, the principal comes and talks, and then they would chant, death to America, death to Israel. And I would spend my summer holidays in the US, so I always wondered, oh my God, this is terrible. I'm not going to say that bad word. That's so bad. Iranian people from a young age would learn to distinguish between the policies of the Islamic regime and what's real. And categorically, and I say this with confidence, Iranian people are some of the most welcoming, most hospitable people to Americans and Israelis and Jewish people, and they can distinguish between the policies of Israel, policies of the United States, and policies of whatever country that we're talking about versus their people. They don't have resentment toward Americans. They don't have resentment toward Israelis, anyone. They are frustrated with the policies of their own regime toward these places and countries and states that have alienated them from them, if you so will. It's fascinating. In fact, my husband went to Iran actually 2 years ago, and maybe it was a mistake, quite frankly, because it was right around the time that another Swedish national got arrested, but he's Swedish. And he came back and said every single person spoke English. Even sort of, this vendor on the street, this person from, the vegetable stand in the bazaar, everybody would say hello and would want to see foreigners in their country. Why? Because they want to come out of this isolation. They want to belong to the rest of the world because they see the same values and they can distinguish between the behavior of their government toward, the countries that you mentioned.
Even under extreme pressure, the Trump administration policy, even under sanctions from the US, which do bite into the economy, people, you don't believe, hold resentment?
Not toward Americans, that's the thing, not toward Americans, but the policies. When you talk to when you speak with Iranians on the ground, they know that the United States is not going to come save them. Mm-hmm. They know, and they would tell you that, the international community, not just the United States, by the way, the international community doesn't care about us, doesn't care about the people. But they know that the government is separate than the people. Mm-hmm. And that is very important in Iran and for Iranians. They don't equate you guys to whatever administration we have right now, because they themselves don't want to be equated to their government.
Right, got you. Okay, any other questions? All right, so right here in the middle, sir, with the bike helmet. I can't see who you are, but go ahead.
Hi, my name is Martin.
Oh, hi.
If by any chance you're familiar with a movie titled Argo.
Yes.
42 years ago, when the hostages were released, I saw them at their first stop here in the United States.
Okay.
Last November, I spoke to one of the former hostages, and I talked to him about the movie Argo, and he commented that he hated the movie. For the benefit of others, it was a rescue mission by the CIA into Argo. And it was quite popular as a movie. And I thought maybe you'd comment on why an American hostage might have such a dim view of the movie Argo. And I'll share what I think.
Okay.
I'll let you answer first.
We'll do that when we get to our
I actually think discussion. I may know who the American hostage was that you're talking about.
It's a small world.
It's a small world. Listen, what I would say, and it goes back to, Mary, what we discussed earlier, is that, the only narratives that exist on Iran are focused on the rogue behavior of the regime and everything that went wrong. And in my view, there's so much opportunity for the mainstream to focus on stories of the people, stories of the realities of life in Iran. And back to another gentleman's question on top, Iranian people are also not victims ready to be saved. Iranian women are not some backward, isolated victims. They're rather survivors. Iranian people are survivors of a theocracy, of a medieval system that has held them back from reaching their dreams and hopes. But if you really think about this, any other country would have collapsed. But Iranians have somehow maintained life despite the corruption that exists because of the government, the brutality that the government enforces to any form of opposition, sanctions, these guys have been choked on all fronts, but still the society maintains, right? And that's telling of the people. So Argo, I wasn't part of that story. That's not my story. But what I would say to your point is that I do believe that there should be other narratives to just the negative that we hear of Iran, with a focus on the people and their stories.
So if we are urged to learn more about the people and learn more of these narratives, COVID is hopefully gone. People are traveling around. American tourism into Iran. Good idea? Bad idea?
Bad idea. Bad idea. Bad idea. And please have this on the record.
A regime where it's not safe, or what do you think?
I have no idea. I just think this regime is quite unpredictable. And that's a shame, Mary. That is such a shame, because there's nothing more powerful than people-to-people engagement.
Right.
And so, again, that's why I spent 3 years writing this book. And I will say that I got so much pushback from editors and publishers, because they wanted me to write the story of, if I escaped Iran, or, woman behind the veil. And I said, I don't want, that's not my story. That story has been told. In fact, if we go to the library, we are in the library, or any bookstore, those are the stories on Iran. But very rarely we have stories and narratives and films about the people and real life. And I sure hope we continue telling these stories rather than victimization of these people or the negative behavior of their government. I think we already know that.
All right, so we're going to get our last question. I'm really going to encourage some of our younger visitors.
Don't be shy.
What brought you here? What brought you here? What are your questions about Iran today? Are you here just because your teacher said you got to come to this event?
It was optional.
All right. How about a question from the teacher of the next generation? All right. Well, did you have a question, actually? Sorry, we do have a question here.
Well, thank you very much for the talk. I think we've learned a lot. I wonder if you might have any advice for my crew of young students here who are from France, Ecuador, Guyana, Kazakhstan,
very cool.
Taiwan, everywhere. One or two words of wisdom, I might ask.
God, I want to hear words of wisdom from you guys. This is what I tell my own students, is that focus on the people in whatever community that interests you. Read the news, read the stories, but try to connect with the people on the ground, however that can be. Social media, again, is such a powerful tool. And understand how much in common you have with that counterpart, because you'll be surprised. And in those common grounds, so many good things can happen.
Those are words of wisdom for the next generation. I think we're going to wrap up this portion now, because I have a feeling there's a lot of good discussion we have left ahead of us and a chance to pick up the book. So we're going to see you back here October 12th for Economic Warfare. We're going to see you on October 19th at the consul's reception, hopefully. But before that, please join me in thanking Tara Kangarlou.
Thank you. Thank you very much.